We are back with the iPad, and you know what that means? That means that we are going to be going through a Reddit thread to discuss some opinions. In this case, we are talking about red flags. Red flags are something that come up a lot in RPG horror stories. They're like a little warning, a flag that lets you know that this person may not be fit for your D&D game, and they are pretty important. Now, in this case, we are definitely not going to be talking about red flags in terms of difference of play style. Like, for example, it's not really a red flag for me if somebody comes into my game who simply doesn't fit. Like, I run a roleplay heavy, story-driven game. If somebody comes in with a dungeon crawler mindset, that's not really a red flag. It's just a difference of play style. That's no problem. I will just recommend that they find a different game that suits them better. These are red flags that will ruin pretty much any game that you're playing. So, without further ado, I think we should jump right into it. 7 red flags to keep an eye out when you're playing D&D, at least according to Reddit. Alright, we are starting right off the bat with, when you watch the player roll an 8 and then use their finger to turn it to a 16 and then look up at you and pretend like you didn't just clearly see them fudge their dice roll. In essence, cheating. This is cheating. We're talking about cheating. Now, I don't talk about cheating a lot in my videos because, surprisingly, cheating doesn't come up a hell of a lot in RPG horror stories. One of Crit Crab's biggest and one of my favorites does involve cheating, and when I first saw that story, it really confused me because cheating is something that just boggles my mind as a DM. D&D, fundamentally, is a game all about cooperative storytelling, telling a tale together with your friends. What's the point of cheating? The game was designed around dice with ones on them. You're meant to lose eventually because in stories, there are low points. Your heroes fail. It adds risk. It adds suspense. Cheating takes that away entirely. For a player, it really ruins the experience. I mean, for me, when I play D&D, a big part of the fun is the thrill of the adventure, and where's the thrill if I guarantee victory with a fake dice roll? It completely ruins the fun, both for me and for the other players. Cheating illustrates for me that this player doesn't respect the game or me as a dungeon master or their fellow players. They prioritize themselves and their own victories above just playing this game with friends. And yeah, that really sucks. In essence, cheating in D&D is really silly, really stupid, and definitely a red flag to keep an eye out for. If you see someone cheating, you definitely should call out and talk to the player about it and see if perhaps you can work something out. Players who have a highly developed idea for a character that wouldn't be in genre for most games and don't seem to be able to hear anything about the setting. They want to be a magical girl piloting a mecha and then pop out with a different set of abilities and stats when the mecha runs out of hit points. You tell them the touchstones for the adventure are more like Wheel of Time or Lord of the Rings, and their eyes just glaze over, and they continue to talk about the mecha. Now, typically when you run into something like this, it's probably not going to be as extreme as somebody wanting to play Diva from Overwatch. However, this is something that you will inevitably run into. It will happen when you're playing D&D. People are going to come in with character options and character choices, character ideas that are way out of left field, and I don't think that's a red flag necessarily. For me, I play with a lot of new players, and a lot of new players come in with crazy ideas because it's their first time and they're just really excited, really enthusiastic, and I don't want to sour that for them. That's awesome. However, the red flag for me is where they are unwilling to change their character concept in any way. When I tell them, hey, your idea is awesome, I love it, but we might need to make some changes to make it fit with the setting better, and their eyes, like the OP said, glaze over and they just stop caring. They don't care at all about the setting and story I'm trying to build. They don't care about the other player characters and making it fit with the party with them, etc., etc., etc. That shows me one thing. It shows me that this player lacks flexibility, which is super important when you are playing Dungeons & Dragons. Don't get me wrong. Players have a lot of agency in D&D. However, they do not have complete control. There are dice rolls, there's the dungeon master, there's the choices of the other players. There are a lot of factors that are going to affect the character story that you are going to play through. And if you are an inflexible role player, well, you might take it with a little bit less grace. Flexibility is incredibly important when playing D&D. Story developments are going to come up, unexpected things are going to happen, and if a player is unwilling to change their character, in session 0 before the game even starts, that is a big warning sign to me that they're not going to have a great time playing a game with a lot of unpredictable results. Here's my homebrew spider humanoid race. Yeah, I've playtested it a few times, it's not OP. Proceeds to have 60 movement speed, natural poison bite attacks, and natural paralysis web action at level 1, and gets annoyed when I have NPCs react to their terrified form. This red flag and story shows me two things: bringing in unapproved homebrew, and bringing in a character with a video game mindset. Number 1, unapproved homebrew. This is pretty simple. Don't do it. Whenever I propose homebrew to my players, I don't just thrust it upon them. And I'm the DM. I would be pretty annoyed if one of my players suddenly came into my game with a complete homebrew spell that insta-wipes enemies and heals the party up to full hit points. That would be really bad. I always run the homebrew I find by my players, and when they find homebrew, if they find homebrew, they run it by me. And that is the way it should be done, making sure that everyone at the table is aware of what's in the game and what's not in the game, what's possible and what's not possible. Very, very important, and something that this player clearly did not do. Also, the final sentence kind of implies that the spider race was allowed into the game, which is fine, I guess, but the player continued on with another problem: a video game mindset. Now, what do I mean by this? Basically, going into D&D and acting like it's Skyrim. Now, can you play a D&D game like a video game? Yes. I'm sure there are DMs out there that play D&D with video game logic, where players can walk around as horribly monstrous, grotesque races, no one reacts, not a big deal. Or players pickpocket somebody in plain sight, nobody reacts, not a big deal. That's fine. Those are the games that some people run, and that's okay with me. However, in a lot of D&D games, they prioritize and hold some level of immersion and making the world a little bit more believable than your typical open world video game. While not necessarily a red flag per se, just an annoying habit, some players do come into D&D with that mindset and kind of ruin the experience for players and DMs who want to hold themselves to that more immersive standard, who want to have a more believable world. Going in with a video game mindset can kind of ruin that immersive feel for a lot of players and dungeon masters. I think it was XP to level 3. He had a great skit about people who play D&D like Skyrim. And while the skit was hilarious, I don't believe I would be laughing much if I actually had a player like that in my own game. Players with main character syndrome. I feel like most RPG horror stories, even the ones where I don't put main character syndrome into the title, can be traced back to main character syndrome. Not necessarily in the game, but out of it. People who think they're the exception. People who think that they should be in control, that they should be allowed to do whatever they want, and everyone else should just listen because that's the way it is. And yeah, that's not good. Now, I will say, I don't necessarily see this as a red flag because it usually pops up during the game, not before it. However, this is why Session Zeros exist. If somebody has complete disregard for other player characters, if somebody has complete disregard for you as the DM, if they're trying to center the story, the quests, everything around their own character during Session 0, if right off the bat they're talking about how they should change the quest and go along a path to reclaim their character's lost kingdom, then that might be a red flag. Now again, it could just be enthusiasm, but make sure to explain to players like that this is a team-based game. Cooperation is key when playing Dungeons & Dragons, and that main character syndrome can really sour the experience for other players who want their characters to be in the spotlight as well. People who can't respond on their own when you are trying to schedule the next session. I'm so sick of messaging everyone directly when there is a group notification. My players out there, if you're watching this, you guys are great. I will say that this is something that every dungeon master is going to face. Scheduling is the true RPG horror story. You are going to face scheduling conflicts. Some of them may last months, but that's just the nature of getting multiple people together. People have work, people have class, it happens. But yes, players out there, please do pay attention to the group chat. Please do send in your scheduling. Please help your dungeon master to schedule this game. It is so stress-inducing for many dungeon masters out there. It is so stress-inducing to many DMs out there who are trying to schedule their games. They work and prep for weeks at a time, and then when they finally are ready for the session, people flake, people don't respond to scheduling, and yeah, it really is hurtful. It's demoralizing in a way. Now, I'm not saying that people who are busy are bad people or bad D&D players. Absolutely not. People have lives, and there is a life outside of D&D, as hard as that is to believe sometimes. But that doesn't mean that you can't communicate. Be open with your DM and explain to them what is going on. My players are really good at scheduling right now. At the beginning, sometimes it was rough, but now they're letting me know weeks in advance when they're not available, and it is a godsend. It is amazing, and it makes my game a lot easier to play. Players who try to win D&D. Hoo boy. That is absolutely how I feel about players who try to win D&D. Here's the way to win D&D. In my eyes, the only way to win D&D is this. Everyone's having fun. It's not the completion of the campaign, or the accomplishment of a certain module, or the accomplishment of a certain level requirement. No, it's just, if everyone's having fun, if everyone's having a good time telling the story together, that is winning. You've achieved the goal of Dungeons and Dragons. That's it. It's not killing a certain amount of enemies or doing the most damage. I've had to deal with players that are like that. I talked about one in my RPG horror story video where I covered my own Cursed Stride horror story, where a player was obsessed with dealing the most damage. And yeah, it was kind of annoying because, first and foremost, it again connects back to that video game mindset. And even in a video game, in most games, doing the most damage or getting the most kills isn't really the benchmark of what makes a great player. So it's flawed at a fundamental level, that thought process. However, in D&D, it's even dumber because you're a team. You're supposed to be working together. This isn't a competitive game where you need to do the most amount of damage in order to succeed. I think it's really silly to come into D&D with the mindset of I have to win. In fact, it's doing yourself a disservice. I think D&D will be less fun if you go in with that mindset, because you're not going to be able to enjoy the game and just play it with your friends. Obsession with winning makes it less fun, and therefore, you found one of the only ways to lose at D&D. You lose when people aren't having a good time. So yeah, damage numbers are great. Dealing the most damage is awesome. Bragging in character about how awesome your character was, or having a competitive little bout with another fighter about how much damage you did during combat, that's all fun. But at the end of the day, make sure that everyone's having a good time, because that is the only way to truly win at Dungeons & Dragons. Recently found a new red flag where one player at the table spent the session trying to tell other players what their character should be doing. They would try to justify it by saying it's what their character would do, or argue if the PC didn't agree. This is another form of main character syndrome. There are party leaders. We see them all the time. It seems like in Critical Role Campaign 3, Imogen is turning out to be somewhat of the party leader, whereas in the last Critical Role campaign, Ford was the leader of the Mighty Nine in a way. He made a lot of the decisions, drove a lot of their decision making. In many D&D campaigns, there is a party leader. However, if you look at Ford or Imogen, they're never telling people what their character would do, because that is no fun. Can you argue about plans? Yes. Debates are going to happen between characters. It happens all the time in my campaign. But telling someone what their character is going to do or what their character would do properly is really dumb. At the end of the day, it's not your character. And unless their actions are going to ruin the game for everyone else, you probably shouldn't try to be dictating the actions of another character, because it completely takes away that player's agency. Agency is really important in D&D. Like we said earlier, a player has a lot of agency in Dungeons and Dragons. They make a lot of decisions, and that is important. It's a lot of the allure of this game. That's why a lot of people play D&D, the freedom that it presents. But if another player is restricting that freedom, it does really ruin the experience, and it just feels like you're just being talked down to in a game that you're playing for fun. Is there any problem with party leaders? Absolutely not. But there is a problem when said leader tries to force decisions onto other players. Now, in summary, if you find any of these red flags in your game, there is hope. There is salvation. Talk to the player in question. Open communication is key. If you see this problem brewing, try to nip it in the bud and talk to the other players. Talk especially to the player in question and ask them if they can improve somehow. Give them recommendations and help them out. Ginny D has a great video about talking to problem players. Totally recommend it. It's up here somewhere if I remember to link it in the cards. I probably won't. Just look it up. I don't know. If you guys enjoyed this episode of... I almost said RPG Horror Story. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips and you want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then we also have a Q&Play series where I answer your questions in a rambling, unscripted format while playing some video games. If you want to check that out, it's linked in the cards. And while you're there, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment red flag, and if you have one, leave your personal D&D red flag. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.